Hi, everyone. Well, it was Charles de Gaulle, very passionate speech about the that well, they had to save Paris, so they capitulated shortly after the attacks in 1940. But the speech that Charles de Gaulle gave on the radio to the Parisians to never give up and to keep well, to just try to resist the Nazis. The two people, actually, the two immigrants from the Russian Empire, um, I would say, well, they followed Charles de Gaulle, and they indeed got to action. It was Boris Wilde, the who was Russian. Well, he was Russian-born linguist and just a big science, well, scholar and a poet. He moved to the Russian. He moved to actually he left the Russian Empire in quite an early age, so he didn't really see the revolution, but he considered himself French, and he wanted to resist the Nazis. It was not about being Russian or being a German or being someone else. It was just about knowing that France was his home, and he wanted to fight as much as he could. Obviously, he also served in the army. So that's Boris Wilde. The recording of the previous tour is still available, and I don't think that that video had an issue with the glare. But well, I'm not going into details now, so you can watch it if you missed. And it's important to understand, by the way, André Gide was the one who um, advised to Wilde to go to France, to go to Paris, where in the Museum of a Human, he found a job. He had a wife. His wife was French. He had family, and he, like many other immigrants, which it was already which year? So 1940, and we're talking about the revolution. So for 20 years, of course, most of those Russian immigrants considered themselves French. Anatole Levitsky was the second employee of this museum of a human. He was an anthropologist, and he, together with Bilde, started printing the underground journal. Well, it was not a journal, it was leaflets and all sorts of underground literature to help the resistance movement. Levitsky was from a Jewish family. However, his parents were converted Jews. Most likely, they came from Moscow, and if they lived in Moscow, they had to have converted to be able to live in Moscow. We know that because of the pales of settlement, right? Those restrictions imposed on all Jews. And I spoke a lot about it on my Jewish heritage tour, so I'm not even going into this. Next year, in the end of next year, they got busted, unfortunately, so they were caught. And in February 1942, they were shot to death. They were executed, Wilde and Levitsky. So I'm going a little bit further. We also spoke about Ivan Bunin, the Nobel Prize winner, and his wife, who hid in their house the Jewish families, several Jewish families. This is the new player to me, so I'm going a little bit, I would say, slower, because this is the new option that I discovered when I was trying to sort out this issue with the glare. And Ivan Bunin, he spent the entire war in Nice, in Grasse, in his villa. And originally he was very much against the Bolsheviks, and he hated the Bolsheviks because they took everything away from him. On the other hand, and he hated Stalin, obviously, everything that was about the Soviet regime. But when the Second World War started, things changed quite dramatically. He accepted, in his state, by the way, in Nice, which was territory of the Vichy France, the collaborationist France, and he wrote in his diary that he would never ever accept the Nazis, and he was scared when Stalin was on his way to Tehran for the conference with Roosevelt and Churchill. He was afraid that something, well, could happen to Stalin, so he really worried about him. And we know further on, it became public knowledge that Bunin wanted to go back home, and he even wrote letters to Stalin, but obviously it wasn't really the best time for Stalin to deal with Bunin's issues, because there was war at the doors of Moscow. Ilya Ehrenburg, we spoke about him, who was the Russian journalist, and he managed to somehow both stay in Russia and be published and respected by the government. And also he could travel to Europe and lived months everywhere in Europe, and it was okay. So we know that Ehrenburg became a big journalist. Well, he was a journalist before that, but he gained I would say, the whole country's support, because he was the war correspondent, and he traveled from one camp to another. And he released a very big article, a very important one, very patriotic. And it says "ubey," it means to kill the enemy. And the idea was to just like evoke the patriotic feelings and fight against the Nazi regime. And these are the posters, the Soviet propaganda posters. Well, this one is patriotic posters calling to kill the enemy. This is Boris Mikhails. We spoke about him as well, who was the head of the Jewish committee. And during the Second World War and prior to the Second World War outbreak, this Jewish committee, the Soviet Jewish committee, traveled to the States and across Europe to raise awareness of the issues around the Jews in Germany. And we know that after the war was over, the members of this committee were, almost all of them were killed, especially they started with Mikhails. That's how changeable Stalin was. And that's Mikhails with Albert Einstein and Itzhak Pfeffer in the States in 1943. We spoke a lot about it on my Jewish heritage tours, how Stalin dealt with everyone who, not everyone, but those who served under him before the war, who got to travel. Stalin, after the war, had a lot of trust issues, and he started this witch hunt against the Jewish committee, because, there were several reasons for that. Mainly because he was afraid of their connections with the outer world, right? With let's say, from behind the Iron Curtain. And also later on, we know that there would be many more issues with the Jews, such as doctor's plot and whatnot. We spoke about Nabokov, who we know had immigrated to the States, but whose brother, Sergei was arrested twice by the Nazis, once for homosexualism. You know, the Nazis also persecuted Roma, they persecuted homosexuals together with the Jews. And for the second time, he was captured even for some other reason, and then he died in one of the camps. That's the story. And we also spoke of how the Russian immigration split, the society basically split. They were, I would say, in general, very dispersed, and there was no unity. Maybe that's the reason why the white immigration movement lost. But in a nutshell, we can say that when the war started, the Russian community split into, like, I would say, three big groups. The one was just absolute neutrality. They just wanted to remain neutral. Some of them left, some of them managed to leave France shortly before the occupation. Then others just could not leave because France was already occupied. but they just decide not to get involved, and that was it. Just not involvement because they were Russians. Because they were not Jews. They were not the French. So then there were those who were strictly against the Nazis, such as this person that we spoke about, Maklakov, Alexander Maklakov. He was the first Russian ambassador in France, ambassador of the Russian provisional government. And he took these are just some videos from the Second World War times that I found on YouTube. So Maklakov, who was one of the biggest authorities uh, uh, in Paris and in France among the Russian immigrants, he condemned the Nazi regime, and he supported the Bolsheviks. So all of a sudden, when the war started, he switched his attitude towards the Bolsheviks, and he started calling the Bolsheviks the patriots, and he supported the Bolsheviks wholeheartedly. And so was the big part of the Russian migration movement. What we're looking at is the newspaper that was for some reason very popular and had was sold in really dozens of thousands of copies, called the Paris Courier, Le Courrier de Paris. Парижский вестник in Russian it's called. And so surprisingly, many newspapers, we know, if you watch my previous stories, you know, there were so many different newspapers and journals released, issued by different political parties, or absolutely not political as well. So most of them got closed under the Nazis, but Парижский вестник, Le Courrier de Paris, thrived. And the issue is that it wasn't obvious from the very beginning, but eventually everyone realized why this newspaper became that popular, because it was the collaborationist newspaper. Yes, because the third group, the third party, the third group of the Russian immigrants, they supported the Nazis, such as, well, let's say one of the most, I would say, avid supporters, passionate supporters of the Nazis was Ivan Shmylov. He was a writer, and he, together with many other writers, got his works published in this newspaper, in the Paris Courier. Shmylov, by the way, was rescued by Bunin from Russia. His son died from hands of Bolsheviks. His son served in the White Army. That's his son, that's his wife. His son was executed in the 1920s. So Shmylov, well, one would think, had to absolutely hate the Bolsheviks, right? And he had to, it's just impossible to imagine that he would support someone who had killed his own son and the only son. Well, but Shmylov saw this from a different angle. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And he wasn't the only one. He was a popular artist. Well, not the artist, he was a popular writer. And he released several big works, not just stories, but like books, quite philosophical, where he openly expressed his support of the Nazis, hate towards Jews, that because he saw that the Jews were the threat for the European civilization, and many people followed him. Yeah, absolutely. He was also the big supporter of Andrei Vlasov. Andrei Vlasov is a very interesting character. Before we get down to Vlasov, I just would like to make sure that the video is okay for everyone. So I will do it like this. Hold on a second. I will turn on the chat, and I will just, well, I'd like to see if the video is fine for you. Please let me know on the chat if it's all good, so I could carry on. I spent many hours trying to figure out. Hope you behaved. Yes, I behaved, Ellen. I behaved on the festival. Thank you so much, everyone. So we can go on. That's good. Whew. Thank you, Delarose. Thank you. Good to see you. Okay, we go back to Andrei Vlasov. I'm switching off the chat and go on. Okay, I just need to, now I know the best way to share the videos. I hope so. I hope so. The only thing is now I need to figure out this new player, but I hope it's okay. So, Vlasov. Mm-hmm. Okay, it should be fine. Well, if something is wrong, I know you will contact me and let me know what is wrong. Vlasov is an interesting character. He was a military man, and for a long time he was he was the supporter of the democracy of the white well, he was not the supporter of the white army. For some time he was, in the early years, he was kind of a, I would say, pro monarchy. We're talking here about the First World War, so he served in the First World War. He even served as a very young man in military campaigns before the First World War. But in general, I would say he was, I would say, quite loyal to the power. Then after the revolution, he stayed in the country. He uh, he served in the Russian army, and in the early years of the war, in the 1941, he thought, well, in the Red Army against the Nazis, and he even attempted, he participated in the attempt to leave the siege of Leningrad in 1941. And the siege started in September, 27th of September, 1940. And we know that the siege would not be lifted up until January 1944, basically. So 872 days. So this never happened, and he was captured by the Nazis. He was captured and he was taken to Germany, where he defected. He betrayed the Soviet Union, and he collaborated with the Nazis. That was it. And Vlasov, I would say that this is now a very much derogatory term in Russian. There is and now, by the way, it's been in use, even, well, given the situation, it's I would say very much in use. He is a Vlasovitz, like he's a betrayer. So everyone who betrayed the interests of the country and collaborates with the enemies is called the Vlasovitz, like the one who served under Vlasov. So Vlasov was in charge of the formation of several like big groups. They were called like Russian liberation forces, basically. And they had several names, because these groups would be formed across Europe, in France, in Czechoslovakia, in Yugoslavia, and several other countries, and they will have different names. But the idea would be, and you can see Vlasov here with the Nazis. So Vlasov was in charge of this organization that basically consisted of Russian immigrants from the Russian Empire, not necessarily Russians, right? Гриш, твой телефон заряжается. За тобой. Sorry, I had to help Grisha find his phone. Ты брал свой телефон сам, зайчик, у меня его нет. Он там лежал. I don't know where your phone is, but it was charging over there on the sofa. I'm sorry, dear. Oh, you found it. Very good. So have, I don't need to launch another rescue operation. Very good. And basically those groups consisted of, the Russian immigrants who supported the Nazis in their fight against the Bolshevism. But it's important to understand. I don't want to. So, by the way, that's philosophy with Goebbels in February 1945. Just in case, I don't mean to save face here or fence out anyone. So collaboration is where collaboration is. So yes, that goes without saying. But many of these people truly believed that Nazis would help them fight the Bolsheviks. And after that, they would be able to go back home, which was not the case. We know, well, I like this photo very much. That's philosophy with a rabbit. I mean, it's absolutely surreal. So needless to say that Vlasov, after the war was over, in very first months after the war was over, eventually he was captured, and there was a trial, and nobody knew even about this trial. It was a secret trial, and the result of this trial. So obviously he was like, you wouldn't be surprised to know that the Soviets convicted him to the capital punishment. So he was executed the very next day. And it only became known afterwards, like post factum. This is exactly the cutout from the newspaper of what the superior committee of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union, what was the ruling of the court. And so he was pronounced guilty and everything. And then here in the very end, it said that everything had been done already. That was it. So we move on. With this newspaper, Parижский вестник, Le Courrier de Paris, many people were published there. Nowadays, mistakenly, some people say that everyone whose works were published there, they were collaborationists. Not exactly. The thing is that the Nazis closed most of the Russian language media, and people just needed money. But indeed, there were some who didn't need to be published to survive, like Sergei Efron. I spoke about him on my Russian ballet tours. The recordings of my tours, 750 of them, I believe, now are available for my sponsors. And well, if it's one or two tours, it's always easy just to contact me and I can sort it out. So in that big series of tours of Diaghilev and other Russian ballet dancers, there was Sergei Efron, who was one of the last, I would say, flames of Diaghilev, and also his one of the last stars of Diaghilev ballet seasons before Diaghilev passed away. So Sergei Efron, who stayed in Paris, and he was the director of the Paris Opera. He had his words published in this newspaper, and he didn't need to be published to survive. However, with Sergei Efron, by the way, we know that even if he accepted the Nazi regime, he never collaborated with it, because when Hitler came to Paris, he wanted to see the ballet, and there was no one there in the theater on that day. But everyone knew that Hitler would be coming on that very day to watch that very ballet, and there was no one there. And Sergei Efron was on the loose. So he had to be hiding for several months from Hitler, because he would have been, definitely he would have been, well, put in jail, I guess, for that. I'm not sure, but definitely it would have somehow affected Sergei Efron. Pyotr Krasnov, I don't expect you to know his name, Ataman, which means it's kind of the head of the Cossacks force. The Cossacks were the people from the south of Russia, south of Ukraine, and also other southern areas. So they were known as fierce fighters. They were never, by the way, enslaved. So they were big army regiments who served in the First World War, in the Civil War, and Pyotr Krasnov, he served in the First World War, but we know that he actually was a big supporter of Germany. And at some point, he also defected and he left for Germany eventually during the Soviet time. So he defected and he lived in Germany when the Nazis came to power. He was okay with that, absolutely. Again, he also saw Jews as a big threat to European civilization, and he thought that Hitler would be the savior for the people of Russia. That's how he saw it, and he spoke about it publicly in the in the Paris Courier and just in public. So it was. Mm, he was a big figure, by the way. He he was criticized obviously by others. That's, by the way, Denikin, who was the head of one of the big divisions in the White Army movement, and that's Krasnov. So they were big enemies, eternal enemies. And Krasnov had quite a lot of authority among those well, I would say pro-Nazi Russian groups. So we know that Krasnov was on friendly terms with Wilhelm II. We know that, but that was in the First World War, right? And but his, I would say, support of Germany continued even after the First World War. So that he moved to Germany, got German citizenship, and didn't leave when Nazis came to power. He was a big supporter of the Nazis. But again, it's important. I'm not fencing out anyone, but it looks like with the Krasnov, it was the same thing. Yeah, we're not saying that that he didn't well, obviously he didn't condemn the Nazis to well to have killed 6 million Jews in Holocaust. Obviously he didn't condemn them for that. But again, so his thought was that Hitler would save Russia from Stalin and the Red Army. Needless to say that after a trial, Krasnov was also executed. He was hanged. But he believed that Nazis would let Russians go back to Russia. He didn't even consider for a minute that Hitler would never do that. Hitler saw the Slavs as, again, sort of a much inferior race. And most probably, well, I'm not sure about the Holocaust, but definitely most Slavs would be got rid of, and those that survived would probably be sort of free workforce and slaves for the big superior, well, German nation. That's the story. And those people who followed him, those Russians who followed Vlasov or the Krasnov, well, they most of them also had the same vision of it. So with Belgrade, so let's talk about these movements across Europe. So in Belgrade, in Yugoslavia, I would say there were not too many people, but in general there were about 3,000 people that enrolled in this Russian protective corps. And this was pro-Nazi. It was collaborationist organization that formed a small regiment, well, within the Nazi army. But there were about from 2 to 3,000 people only, and eventually they, well, there were maybe several times when this Russian protective corps actually participated in any military actions. Very little. Why so? Was it because Hitler never really, trusted these groups? Most probably, yes. They were not numerous also. So we know that only after 1943, when it started to become quite clear that Hitler was not winning, uh, he eventually allowed such groups as Russian Protective Corps or Russian Liberation Corps to fight, but those were very limited military actions. What we're looking at, this is the photo of this Russian Protective Corps headquarters in Belgrade, well, former Yugoslavia, nowadays Serbia. And this photo was taken it was a very, I would say, short period of time when this photo could have been taken, because it was strictly forbidden to take photos of any military buildings, posts, headquarters, whatnot. But when the war was over, but this banner was still there, someone took this photo. This is the only photo of the building with such a banner. But that's the proof that yes, indeed, there was such a corpse. Yes, and these people, so the members of this corps, would be going from town to town in Belgrade. They would be basically going from apartment to apartment, asking whether the Russian immigrants wanted to join the movement to protect Russia from the Bolsheviks. They didn't say we want to support Hitler in this and that. They didn't say the support Hitler killing the Jews in Holocaust. No, they were basically just saying what Russians wanted to hear, but there were only 3,000 people that followed. And we know there was quite a big community, Russian immigrant community. So this was not really a big force. So it's nice to know there were not so many people that supported the Nazis and the pro-Nazi Russian groups. But well, I like this photo, by the way. So these are, by the way, Nazi officers in it's also Belgrade, and we know that they indeed visited this corps. We know they came for just to rally the big team and lift their spirits. It's interesting that they're drinking coffee here. I wonder if this is decaf. I found out that Nazis who basically were very much, I would say, pro healthy lifestyle. They developed. There was a German scientist that invented the decaf coffee, and there was a big support of the decaf coffee in the Nazi Germany. So I wonder if it's a decaf that they are drinking. Most probably not, but just an interesting fact. The factory, by the way, is still around, but I didn't know that it was the Nazis. It was exactly in the Nazi times when then the decaf coffee was invented. Yeah. So with Czechoslovakia, we had a tour about Prague, one episode. We know that there were also not so many Russians living in Prague because it was mostly students and scholars that Prague was interested in provided shelter to. So the Russian community was not very big. And we also know that that in the cinemas, and people like to go to the cinema. So this is yeah, Hitler in Czechoslovakia, in Prague. We know that people like to go to the cinema. And Nazis, under the Nazis, before every film, Nazis would be sharing a little bit of the recap of okay, like not even the recap, like the heads up of how the things were on the front line, and they just showed how they raised villages, towns, Russian towns, European towns in the cinema. They just showed that, and that's why it was very much anti-propaganda or for joining those you know pro-Nazi groups. To We know that they obviously they were collaborationists. They were in all these countries. They were collaborationists, regardless of well, like Russian immigration. I'm here talking about the Russian immigration, but obviously we know that they were collaborationists in all the countries of Europe. We know that. So I'm just having a specific focus on the Russian groups because again they were like several thousands of Russians participating in these small short campaigns and joining these groups. They were not very effective, obviously, but they would come after. So when in 1945 the Soviet army liberated Prague, and in general I would say Czechoslovakia, there was a big like intelligence group called SMERSH, so Main Directorate of Counterintelligence. SMERSH can be translated as no, you can't translate. It stands for Смерть шпионам, death to the spies. Basically, it was counterintelligence agency called SMERSH, and they would be coming after collaborationists, including obviously exactly the members of those pro-Nazi groups of Russian Protective Corps or the similar organizations, and also they would be coming after the Russian immigrants, just Russian immigrants, and that was a very daunting prospect. Some people uh, it's just interesting. No, it's not interesting. Just imagine that you first had to flee from the Nazis, and then where you are, you're trapped because the Nazis are already there, and then the Soviet army is coming, and there was war, there were battles. The Prague was so badly damaged during the war, and then not only Prague. I'm just talking about Prague here, but we know that it affected almost the entire Europe. And then your liberation army comes and it's here to liberate you. And again, you had to flee. Some people managed to escape, some people stayed, and some people just hoped that the Smersh would never come after them. Unfortunately, they did. Smersh came after many Russian immigrants. And when we had a tour about the Prague community and about this, the big community house that was built by Russian professors, again, I remind you that it was mostly about the academic community that, well, Prague was interested in. And so there were few Russian immigrants other than the ones having academic careers or students. So most of these people were already, I would say, quite advanced in their age. And yet, about 40% of the people who lived in this house were taken to Gulag. These people were, okay, almost at their deathbed, yet they were taken to Gulag as, well, spies, defectors, and whatnot. Later on, Stalin all of a sudden had a change of nature, changed his mind, and there was issued in 1946. So it's written there, the 14th of June, 1946. This change of heart of Stalin. So he issued a decree that for a limited period of time, it allowed everyone who left Russia after the 7th of November 1917 could come to Russia, to Soviet Union, and they would be pardoned. And they had time up until the 1st of November 1946, so they had a few months basically. So they would be pardoned and would be given Russian citizenship again, Soviet citizenship, and they would be able to, well, just to get on with their lives. And they were about 3 to 4,000 people that accepted that invitation, and people left. Well, Europe was in ruins, and the Soviet Union was a liberator. Well, I'm not going into details like how Europe was liberated. I'm not going into there, but there were a lot of issues with that as well, especially in those who know this history of the Baltic states. Well, we know how harsh it was, but it's not about that. So, and about 20% of those people who left who left to the victorious Soviet Union, they eventually also, well, they will become after as well. And speaking of Vasily, sorry, I called him Alexei, Vasily Maklakov, I've never been good with names. So Vasily Maklakov actually welcomed this initiative of Stalin, who was the former ambassador. He even participated in the big event thrown in the Soviet government in Paris. Vladimir Nabokov was a big critic of that. He was pretty much critical of this idea of Maklakov, because Nabokov felt that there was something wrong about that invitation. Ivan Bunin would have accepted that invitation, but he never did eventually. So in 1950s, in the early 1950s, there was another attempt, but his message was lost. We don't know exactly, and then he passed away in the 1950s, and that was it. Alexei Tolstoy, who was one of the very first who left in the 1920s, left back to the Soviet Union, who was pardoned and built a great career in literature in the Soviet Union. He traveled quite a lot to France, especially to Paris, because still it was the biggest, I would say, hub of Russian immigrants in Europe. And he, kind of promoted the Soviet Union. He encouraged people to come. He spoke many times with Bunin before Bunin passed away. But so eventually, most people, I would say that some people left to the States after the Second World War. Most people stayed in Europe. And we know that 20% of those who decided to go back, they ended up in camps as well. But after Stalin passed away in 1953, things were okay, and there was this thaw period, right, of Khrushchev, when Stalin's cult was basically cancelled, and things were looking up in a way. But I would like to show you a short excerpt from the film, which I highly recommend everyone to watch. And I just want to I just hope you will be able to hear it. I will check and you will let me know just in case. So it's called Перед судом истории in Russian, so the judgment of history. And I spoke about this film before. That it's the story of Shulgin. That's him, Yakov Shulgin, who actually served who was the member of Russian Duma during Nicholas II times. And he participated, he was among those several people who came to to Nicholas II, to his car of the train, where he signed his abdication in March 1917. After that, he fought in the White Army, and then he immigrated, and then he returned to the Soviet Union. He believed he was just, I would say, he believed the big lie from the Soviet propaganda, and he was lured into the country, and he was fooled by the Nazis, who created the big conspiracy and made it look as if he was helped by someone within the country fight the Bolshevik regime. Then he returned. Then he returned to Europe. He wrote a book about it. We know that he wrote a book about his visit to the Soviet Union. And he had no idea that all of that had been planned by the NKVD, by KGB, basically. So he wrote a book. The book was published. That it became known to him that it was all the big plot from the NKVD. And then, well, he stayed in Europe as well. He stayed in France when the war started. He lived in Belgium as well for a while. So he was captured by Smersh, and he was brought to Russia, to the Soviet Union. He was put into prison because he was the defector, right? And then he was released. And then when he was in his 80s, I believe, he was asked to participate in the film. It was basically a big Soviet propaganda film, and the propaganda just wanted to once again nail the White Army movement. And I would like to show you a short episode from this movie, The Judgment of History. It's in Russian, but it has the subtitles here, and I will sum it up in the end. So let's watch. I hope you will be able to hear it. At least I just tick in the right places. You let me know, okay? If you can't hear it, just let me know on the DMs.
Это убийственной резне ее продевали и белые, и красные, потому что кровь родит кровь.
Но руководители белых, видимо, не слишком берегли эту кровь. И вы, Василий Витальевич, вы ведь тоже были в числе основателей добровольческой армии. И стояли в списке под номером 29.
Да. Тогда, в начале, нас было 29, а потом нас стало больше. Значительно больше. Нам поверили, за нами пошли, потому что на наших знаменах было начертано великая, единая, неделимая Россия. И в борьбе за нее я сделал все, что мог, помогая Алексееву, Деникину, Врангелю.
Генерал Юденич, полковник Бермонтовалов, бандит Булак Балахович пролили море крови на Западе.
Да, всех их не перечислить. И потому я не стану перечислять красных командиров. И не буду измерять количество крови, ими пролитой.
I will explain here. So basically, this is Shulgin and his counterpart. They're discussing who was right and who was wrong in the civil war, which started after the revolution of 1917 in October. And Shulgin is basically saying that, yes, indeed, the White Army officers shed a lot of blood, and the Red Army also shed a lot of blood. And it's amazing how in this film, it was supposed to basically labeled the White Army as the underdogs, and that all the bloodshed was in vain and all their fight was in vain, and they were fighting the wrong enemy. But the film eventually came out so anti-Bolshevik, so anti-White Army that it was only shown in cinemas for a few days, because Shulgin just nailed all of them. So Shulgin is saying, yes, you're right, there was a lot of bloodshed. That's why I'm not going to now enumerate all those Red Army officers that shed blood either. And then also there is another thing I want to show you from this very film. So let's go on.
И подлинным центром эмиграции становилось кладбище.
And then Shulgin says, it's not the same episodes. I had to just cut it. And by the way, the entire film you can find on YouTube, on the official YouTube channel of one of the Soviet film studios. So it's an open access. And then he says that the true center of Russian immigration was the cemetery. So Shulgin indeed, he admits that the White Army movement lost, that Russian immigration lost, and they were so dispersed that they were only united in the cemetery. And now we're going to show the excerpt from this very film, how they filmed in Saint-Geneviève-de-Bois cemetery. And we're going to see some old graves of Russian nobility, those people who died before they were able to go back home. They died hoping they would be able to go home.
В Париже, на знаменитом кладбище Сен-Женевьев-де-Буа, нашли свое успокоение деятели с громкими историческими именами.
The Grand Duke Romanov, Gavril. Count Gagarin, not the Gagarin, not the cosmonaut. The Gagarin is a very old aristocratic king. Ryabushinsky, this is one of the Moscow merchants' families whose house we saw in one of the previous tours. One of the most beautiful Art Nouveau houses in Moscow belonged to Ryabushinsky family in Moscow. That's the General Kornilov, who was one of the I would say the most heroic army generals, White Army generals. General Wrangel, who was the head of the Russian government in exile for a while, and the head of the army movement in the first years when they left for Turkey from the south of Russia, in the Gallipoli, and then in Serbia, and then to Paris up until his death. Wrangel was I would say, the icon for Russian immigrants, especially those who served in the White Army.
Здесь хоронили не только людей, но и иллюзии.
Yeah, so in that cemetery, those not only were the people who were buried, but their illusions. Bye-bye, dears. See you soon.